a soft breeze stirred through Philadelphia on the evening of June 29th, 1752. Birds twittered their evensong from the branches of elms and sycamores. The air hung heavy with the scent of honeysuckle and the promise of rain. It was one of those perfect summer evenings that make June in Pennsylvania's colonial capital almost bearable. Almost across the rooftops, dark clouds were assembling. They spilled over the horizon in an inky tide, blotting out the fiery hues of the setting sun and muting the light in the sky to the color of ashes. But though the sky wore a threatening aspect, the people of Philadelphia felt no alarm. For the most part, they had learned to take such displays of nature's tempered tantrums in stride. Even so, a few curious souls paused to watch the clouds gather. Among them, a young woman standing beside her father on the balcony of their home. She watched with wide eyes as streaks of red light split the darkening sky, then vanish as quickly as they came. Then another flash, closer this time, followed by a sound like the crack of doom, and she clung to her father, burying her face against his coat as a bolt of lightning danced across the heavens just above them. This was no ordinary storm. This was a tempest, a maelstrom of wind and water that would go down in history as one of the most violent thunderstorms ever to strike the colonies. In the end, it would also be remembered as the catalyst for one of the most famous experiments in science history. An experiment that would change the course of scientific thought forever. An experiment that may or may not have happened at all, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, the people of Philadelphia could only watch and wonder as the skies above them turned into a monstrous furnace, and the very air grew hot and heavy. In truth, there's never been a bad time to get into physics. But right now, if you're watching this, if it's summer where you are, you probably know that the time is especially ripe. That S. Because our friends, the photons that carry light around the universe, are going a little crazy with the heat. And today's sponsor, Brilliant, wants to help you understand why. I don't know about you, but I always feel kind of lost when the weather forecast mentions things like the dew point and the jet stream and haiku. Intel a cold front from a warm front. But Brilliant has a new course called Introduction to Weather and Climate that covers everything from the Coriolis effect to El Nino to why hurricanes are so terrible. It breaks down complex concepts into small, easily digestible chunks and uses interactive challenges to let you test your understanding along the way. So if you want to learn more about what's going on outside your window, I can't recommend Brilliant enough. Thanks to Brilliant for supporting this C-Show video. And now, back to our story. As the first fat drops of rain began to fall, people hurried indoors, seeking refuge from the coming storm. But one man remained on the balcony. He stood tall and straight, despite the driving rain, his gaze fixed on the roiling sky. His name was Richard, and he was a scientist. Well, technically, he was a printer by trade, but in his free time, he moonlighted as a bit of an amateur scientist. He dabbled in everything from alchemy to astronomy, and tonight, he was hoping to make a little bit of history. See, for years, Richard had been trying to answer a question that had been nagging at him ever since he was a child. What exactly was lightning? Was it, as some people believed, a manifestation of divine wrath? Or was there something more, something a bit more scientific going on? To try and find out, he'd spent months building an elaborate kite, one with a key difference from the simple toys flown for fun. Instead of string, it was made to be flown with a long insulated silk cord, and instead of a little wooden spool, it sported a metal key attached to the end of the string. All that was left was to see if it worked. He held the silk cord in one hand and slowly began to let out the string. As the kite rose higher and higher, the rain intensified, driven by winds that threatened to rip the contraption from his grasp. But he held firm, his eyes fixed on the dark clouds above. Suddenly, a flash of lightning split the sky, followed by a deafening crash of thunder. And right then and there, the kite string connected with the heavens. A jolt of electricity shot up the string, knocking the key right out of his hand. It flew across the night sky, leaving a faint white trail in its wake. Then it hit the house, with a resounding thud. When he ran to retrieve the key, he found that it was smoking and slightly singed. But miraculously, neither he nor his house were on fire. In that instant, lightning was nothing more than electricity. He rushed inside and scribbled down his discovery, knowing that the world needed to hear this news. Of course, You probably already know that the story of how Ben Franklin tamed lightning isn't quite how it went down. For one thing, Richard wasn't actually Richard. His name was Benjamin. And while it's sometimes said that he was a humble printer, the truth is he was actually one of the most prominent men in Philadelphia, a successful businessman, and one of the founding fathers of the country that would soon be born. Secondly, it's a myth that he built a kite to prove that lightning was electricity. Yes, he did famously fly a kite in a thunderstorm, but he didn't build it specifically to make that discovery. In fact, we don't know if he even remembered to do that. Most accounts say he just happened to have one with him when a storm rolled in and seized the moment. Finally, the key didn't fly off the string and leave a white trail behind. That part of the story, along with the story of Ben Franklin surviving the experiment, is pure fiction. What really happened was this. One day after this storm, Ben Franklin sat down and wrote a letter to a friend of his who was a scientist, describing the experiment he'd performed the night before. He explained how he'd watched the key closely and saw sparks fly from it. Because of this, he hypothesized that lightning was caused by electricity. So did Ben Franklin really risk his life to prove that lightning was electricity? The answer, surprisingly, is maybe. See, while it is a common misconception that Ben Franklin was the first to propose that lightning was a form of electricity, he wasn't. People had been making that connection for hundreds of years. What Ben Franklin did was to show that lightning and electricity were one and the same thing, that lightning was simply electricity in action. And he proved it in the most convincing way possible by showing that he could harness lightning to produce electricity. The thing is, we don't have any hard evidence that he actually flew a kite during that storm, or that he even did the experiment at all. The earliest written account of it comes from a story published in a London magazine more than 30 years after the fact, and it's possible, even likely, that it was embellished to make better copy. Not to mention, it would make sense for someone like Benjamin Franklin to embellish the story himself. After all, it was in his interest to make himself look good. But the thing is, regardless of whether or not he risked his life that night in 1752, he definitely risked his reputation. At the time, scientists were nearly universally convinced that electricity was produced by friction, not by atmospheric phenomena like lightning. By saying otherwise, Ben Franklin was going against the entire scientific establishment, and that took a lot of courage, whoever told the story first. It was only after that letter was published that scientists began to take the idea of lightning as electricity seriously. They started experimenting with ways to harness lightning's power, leading to the invention of the lightning rod in 1753. And within a century, lightning rods had been installed on most public buildings in Europe and America. Today, Ben Franklin's name is synonymous with electricity. But as far as the origin story goes, it seems that most of it is just that. A story, except, wait, come back here a second. If we're saying that the story of Ben Franklin and his kite might be false, does that mean lightning isn't electricity? Of course not. We know that lightning is electricity, and we have Ben Franklin to thank for helping us figure that out. We just can't be completely sure that he discovered that principle the way the story goes. But maybe we don't need to know exactly how he discovered it. Sometimes the story is just as powerful as the truth. Hi, this is your host, and this is Chapter 1 of our new series, A Spark of Genius, the story of how we discovered electricity. Join us next time as we continue our journey to uncover the shocking history of electricity, including the true story of the trolley problem. Trolley problem, you know, like the ethical quandary in which you have to choose between letting a runaway trolley kill 5 people or diverting it onto a track where you know that it will kill 1 person. Well, it turns out that version of the story is also not quite true. Don't miss our special 2-part finale, where we explore the surprisingly complicated origins of the thought experiment that's got the internet divided. A soft breeze stirred through Philadelphia on the evening of June 29th, 1752. Birds twittered their evensong from the branches of elms and sycamores. The air hung heavy with the scent of honeysuckle and the promise of rain. It was one of those perfect summer evenings that make June in Pennsylvania's colonial capital almost bearable. Almost across the rooftops, dark clouds were assembling. They spilled over the horizon in an inky tide, blotting out the fiery hues of the setting sun and muting the light in the sky to the color of ashes. But though the sky wore a threatening aspect, the people of Philadelphia felt no alarm. For the most part, They had learned to take such displays of nature's tempered tantrums in stride. Even so, a few curious souls paused to watch the clouds gather. Among them, a young woman standing beside her father on the balcony of their home. She watched with wide eyes as streaks of red light split the darkening sky, then vanish as quickly as they came. Then another flash, closer this time, followed by a sound like the crack of doom, and she clung to her father, burying her face against his coat as a bolt of lightning danced across the heavens just above them. This was no ordinary storm. This was a tempest, a maelstrom of wind and water that would go down in history as one of the most violent thunderstorms ever to strike the colonies. In the end, it would also be remembered as the catalyst for one of the most famous experiments in science history. An experiment that would change the course of scientific thought forever. An experiment that may or may not have happened at all, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, the people of Philadelphia could only watch and wonder as the skies above them turned into a monstrous furnace, and the very air grew hot and heavy. In truth, there's never been a bad time to get into physics. But right now, if you're watching this, if it's summer where you are, you probably know that the time is especially ripe. Because our friends, the photons that carry light around the universe, are going a little crazy with the heat. And today's sponsor, Brilliant, wants to help you understand why. I don't know about you, but I always feel kind of lost when the weather forecast mentions things like the dew point and the jet stream and haiku. Intel a cold front from a warm front, but Brilliant has a new course called Introduction to Weather and Climate that covers everything from the Coriolis effect to El Nino to why hurricanes are so terrible. It breaks down complex concepts into small, easily digestible chunks and uses interactive challenges to let you test your understanding along the way. So if you want to learn more about what's going on outside your window, I can't recommend Brilliant enough. Thanks to Brilliant for supporting this C-Show video. And now, back to our story. As the first fat drops of rain began to fall, people hurried indoors, seeking refuge from the coming storm. But one man remained on the balcony. He stood tall and straight, despite the driving rain, his gaze fixed on the roiling sky. His name was Richard, and he was a scientist. Well, technically, he was a printer by trade, but in his free time, he moonlighted as a bit of an amateur scientist. He dabbled in everything from alchemy to astronomy, and tonight, he was hoping to make a little bit of history. See, for years, Richard had been trying to answer a question that had been nagging at him ever since he was a child. What exactly was lightning? Was it, as some people believed, a manifestation of divine wrath? Or was there something more, something a bit more scientific going on? To try and find out, he'd spent months building an elaborate kite, one with a key difference from the simple toys flown for fun. Instead of string, it was made to be flown with a long insulated silk cord, and instead of a little wooden spool, it sported a metal key attached to the end of the string. All that was left was to see if it worked. He held the silk cord in one hand and slowly began to let out the string. As the kite rose higher and higher, the rain intensified, driven by winds that threatened to rip the contraption from his grasp. But he held firm, his eyes fixed on the dark clouds above. Suddenly, a flash of lightning split the sky, followed by a deafening crash of thunder. And right then and there, the kite string connected with the heavens. A jolt of electricity shot up the string, knocking the key right out of his hand. It flew across the night sky, leaving a faint white trail in its wake. Then it hit the house, with a resounding thud. When he ran to retrieve the key, he found that it was smoking and slightly singed. But miraculously, neither he nor his house were on fire. In that instant, lightning was nothing more than electricity. He rushed inside and scribbled down his discovery, knowing that the world needed to hear this news. Of course, you probably already know that the story of how Ben Franklin tamed lightning isn't quite how it went down. For one thing, Richard wasn't actually Richard. His name was Benjamin. And while it's sometimes said that he was a humble printer, the truth is he was actually one of the most prominent men in Philadelphia, a successful businessman, and one of the founding fathers of the country that would soon be born. Secondly, it's a myth that he built a kite to prove that lightning was electricity. Yes, he did famously fly a kite in a thunderstorm, but he didn't build it specifically to make that discovery. In fact, we don't know if he even remembered to do that. Most accounts say he just happened to have one with him when a storm rolled in and seized the moment. Finally, The key didn't fly off the string and leave a white trail behind. That part of the story, along with the story of Ben Franklin surviving the experiment, is pure fiction. What really happened was this. One day after the storm, Ben Franklin sat down and wrote a letter to a friend of his who was a scientist, describing the experiment he'd performed the night before. He explained how he'd watched the key closely and saw sparks fly from it. Because of this, he hypothesized that lightning was caused by electricity. So did Ben Franklin really risk his life to prove that lightning was electricity? The answer, surprisingly, is maybe. See, while it is a common misconception that Ben Franklin was the first to propose that lightning was a form of electricity, he wasn't. People had been making that connection for hundreds of years. What Ben Franklin did was to show that lightning and electricity were one and the same thing, that lightning was simply electricity in action. And he proved it in the most convincing way possible by showing that he could harness lightning to produce electricity. The thing is, we don't have any hard evidence that he actually flew a kite during that storm, or that he even did the experiment at all. The earliest written account of it comes from a story published in a London magazine more than 30 years after the fact, and it's possible, even likely, that it was embellished to make better copy. Not to mention, it would make sense for someone like Benjamin Franklin to embellish the story himself. After all, it was in his interest to make himself look good. But the thing is, regardless of whether or not he risked his life that night in 1752, he definitely risked his reputation. At the time, scientists were nearly universally convinced that electricity was produced by friction, not by atmospheric phenomena like lightning. By saying otherwise, Ben Franklin was going against the entire scientific establishment. And that took a lot of courage, whoever told the story first. It was only after that letter was published that scientists began to take the idea of lightning as electricity seriously. They started experimenting with ways to harness lightning's power, leading to the invention of the lightning rod in 1753. And within a century, lightning rods had been installed on most public buildings in Europe and America. Today, Ben Franklin's name is synonymous with electricity. But as far as the origin story goes, it seems that most of it is just that. A story, except, wait, come back here a second. If we're saying that the story of Ben Franklin and his kite might be false, does that mean lightning isn't electricity? Of course not. We know that lightning is electricity, and we have Ben Franklin to thank for helping us figure that out. We just can't be completely sure that he discovered that principle the way the story goes. But maybe we don't need to know exactly how he discovered it. Sometimes the story is just as powerful as the truth. Hi, this is your host, and this is chapter 1 of our new series, A Spark of Genius, the story of how we discovered electricity. Join us next time as we continue our journey to uncover the shocking history of electricity, including the true story of the trolley problem. Trolley problem, you know, like the ethical quandary in which you have to choose between letting a runaway trolley kill 5 people or diverting it onto a track where you know that it will kill 1 person. Well, it turns out that version of the story is also not quite true. Don't miss our special 2-part finale, where we explore the surprisingly complicated origins of the thought experiment that's got the internet divided. Chapter 2: The World Before the Kite. So let us go back to 1749 and imagine what the world was like before Ben Franklin sent that kite flying. For centuries, humans had wondered what caused lightning and thunder. Some ancient cultures blamed the god of thunder. Others thought lightning was caused by mythical creatures like griffins or dragons breathing fire. And many cultures believed that lightning was divine retribution, a sign of God's anger. But by the mid-18th century, people were beginning to come up with more scientific explanations for the storm. They theorized that lightning might be produced by electrical forces, because electricity was a mysterious new phenomenon that people were just beginning to understand. Electricity was first discovered in 600 BC in Greece. The ancient Greeks noticed that if they rubbed amber with a piece of fur, it would attract small objects like feathers. In 1600, an English scientist named William Gilbert coined the term electricity from the Greek word for amber. But despite knowing that lightning and electricity were somehow related, people still didn't know how to study them. At the time, electricity was produced by rubbing materials together, which made a lot of people think that it needed to be produced in large quantities to cause something as powerful as lightning. That meant that for hundreds of years, scientists never got closer to understanding the true nature of lightning. So, what did they know? One thing they knew was that lightning rods worked. If you put a metal rod on top of a building and ran a wire down inside it, and then connected that wire to the water pipes, which were usually made out of copper, the building was safe from lightning strikes. People had no idea why this worked, but they were happy to have a way to protect their property. What they didn't know was that the metal rod and the wire acted like a giant lightning rod. See, when lightning struck a building without a lightning rod, the electricity would travel through the structure's wooden beams until it reached the water pipes, where it would then travel through the water into the ground. By providing a path of least resistance to the electricity, the lightning rod prevented damage to the building. And while we can explain why lightning rods work today, we do need to explain that to you, since you are watching this video on a computer or phone. That is lightning protection in action. The circuitry within your device provides a path of least resistance for electricity to flow through, protecting the delicate internal components from being damaged. Lightning rods weren't the only things that helped people better understand the power of electricity. By the middle of the 18th century, scientists had invented tools like the Leyden jar, which could store electricity. The Leyden jar helped scientists learn that electricity could be contained, and that led some of them to believe that lightning could also be contained. One German professor even built a machine that shot sparks from a tube by trapping lightning inside a glass jar and turning the electricity into visible sparks. He called his invention a thunderer. But most scientists still thought that lightning was produced by the friction of the air itself, and they were trying to figure out how to replicate that friction in a lab. The problem was, nobody really knew much about the air itself. They didn't know what it was made of, what it contained, or how it moved. And without that knowledge, it was difficult to figure out how lightning worked. Then there was the issue of scale. The equipment these scientists used to study electricity was very small. They were dealing with tiny sparks that jumped between two objects if they were close enough. But lightning bolts were miles long. How could a spark that was so small fit into a tiny machine be related to something as big as a lightning bolt? In short, they were on the wrong track. These scientists were all trying to recreate lightning by rubbing stuff together. Meanwhile, Ben Franklin was busy flying kites in thunderstorms, figuring out that lightning was electricity. His thinking was different from these scientists. They wanted to understand electricity by studying its smallest parts, while Franklin wanted to understand lightning by studying lightning itself. And Franklin wasn't the only one asking questions about electricity. In the American colonies, there was a group of men who were also curious about the mysterious new science. This was not a formal group, so we don't know exactly who was part of it, but the core of it consisted of hobbyist scientists who gathered together to share their ideas. The group included printers, silversmiths, a doctor, a jeweler, and a statesman. Together, they pursued their interest in electricity without the constraints of academic politics or the expectations of the scientific establishment. This gave them the freedom to ask questions that other scientists hadn't thought of, like what happens when you connect a Leyden jars together, or what happens when you place a grounded metal ball near a lightning rod. Sometimes they conducted experiments together, like when a member of the group, John Hearne, asked the famous preacher George Whitefield to conduct an experiment for him. Whitefield agreed and touched a lightning rod while standing in a tub of water during a thunderstorm. He survived unscathed, proving that lightning rods were safe to touch. Other times, members of the group conducted experiments on their own. One day, a young man named Thomas Hurlbert was walking home after a meeting when he saw a thunderstorm rolling in. He ran out into the street, took off his coat and hat, tucked them under his arm, and stood under a tree during the storm. Then he allowed lightning to strike him, and he survived unharmed. These men were all educated and curious, but they weren't scientists. They weren't paid to study electricity. They did it because they wanted to. And that's what set them apart from the rest of the world. They were amateurs, and that's what allowed them to ask the right questions. See, in Europe, scientists were working to build a theoretical framework for electricity, and they thought they had to start with the smallest parts. In America, people were studying lightning itself, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. So what was it like to be a scientist in America at the time? Well, you can find out next time. In Chapter 3, The Rise of a Reputation, we'll explore how Ben Franklin became famous for his kite experiment and how that changed everything. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, do not forget to like and subscribe. So you won't want to miss out on future episodes of the series. You can also follow along with the series on a website, where you'll find additional resources for each episode, including lesson plans for teachers. That's it for now. Thanks for watching. In our last episode, we met an 11-year-old boy who was apprenticed to a printer. In this episode, we'll learn about Chapter 3, Young Benjamin Franklin. A Curious Mind. Hi, I'm your host. This is the Benjamin Franklin series. And now, back to the story. As a kid, Ben Franklin was born in Boston, Massachusetts, and he grew up there. But not for long. His father moved the family to Philadelphia when Ben was 12 years old. Now, remember, Ben's father is a candle and soap maker. So when they moved to Philadelphia, they didn't move to some great big city. They just moved from one small town to another. Ben was apprenticed to his brother's print shop, so he would work there after school hours and on Saturdays. That was his job. But being a teenager with too much time on his hands, he couldn't be contained in the print shop. He had too much energy and curiosity to do just one thing, so he started experimenting with a pair of wooden swimming fins that he had made. He strapped them onto his feet and jumped into the icy waters of the Delaware River. But quickly, he decided that swimming was not all that it was cracked up to be. He came out of the river with all that force and vigor that only a young, curious teenager can muster. He took off his wet shoes and socks and hung them by the fireplace to dry. And while they were drying, he began tapping them with a hammer, and he discovered that the leather was vibrating and making a sound. Now, Ben wasn't stupid. He knew that what he was doing was silly, but he did it anyway because he was curious. He wanted to know what would happen if he tapped those shoes more or less, harder or softer. He wanted to see what kind of sounds he could make with the shoes. This led him to build a musical instrument called a glass harmonica, which consisted of a hollow tube and a set of graduated discs made of glass that were placed inside the tube. The player would then use a crank handle to spin the discs around and make music. This instrument became quite popular in the 18th century. Mozart even composed pieces for it. But don't worry, Ben didn't become a musician. He was still apprenticed to a printing press, and he eventually took over the business when his brother went to London to become an engraver. Ben used his printing press to publish things like Poor Richard's Almanac, which included weather forecasts and other useful information for farmers. It was very popular and helped make Ben Franklin famous throughout the colonies. He experimented with different types of ink and different types of paper, and he even invented a type of printing press that used movable type. That's right, he actually invented the printing press. Up until that time, books had been printed by hand, which was extremely slow and expensive. Gutenberg had invented the printing press about 100 years before Ben Franklin. But his press used movable type, which meant that each letter had to be set by hand. Ben's press used movable type, but the letters were cast in one piece. This made it much easier to print books quickly and cheaply. He also developed a new process for making paper that was strong and durable. See, Franklin was a man of action. Everything he did was practical, even his experiments. Even when he was making music with his glass harmonica or playing with his swimming fins, there was always some practical application to it. And that brings us to electricity. When Ben was just 19 years old, he saw a demonstration of a Leyden jar, which was an early device used to store electricity. It was basically a glass jar with a metal cap and a wire coming out of it. When the wire was touched, electricity would flow out of it and people would receive a shock. Ben Franklin was fascinated by this jar, and by electricity in general. But like everything else he studied, he didn't just want to understand how it worked. He wanted to improve it. He began experimenting with different ways of charging the jar and increasing its capacity. He also began studying the properties of electricity, such as the fact that it could be conducted through wires, but not through air. One day, Ben Franklin was walking down the street when he saw a woman holding a metal umbrella. He stopped and stared at her as she walked by. Ben Franklin had invented the lightning rod. You see, he had been thinking about how electricity could be used to protect buildings from lightning damage, and he had read about the metal umbrella that was being used in France to protect people from lightning strikes. He thought to himself, why not combine the two? And that's exactly what he did. He designed a system of rods made of metal that were attached to buildings, and they were grounded so that electricity could flow through them. This protected buildings from lightning damage. It was a brilliant invention, but it didn't make him famous. You see, Ben Franklin continued to experiment with electricity. He flew a kite in a thunderstorm to prove that lightning was actually electricity. He also invented the lightning rod, but he didn't take out a patent. You see, Ben believed that inventions should be shared so that everyone could benefit from them. He didn't want to keep his inventions secret or use them to make money. Now, Ben Franklin wasn't stupid. He knew that most people wouldn't take advantage of his inventions. He knew that many people would continue to believe that lightning was caused by the wrath of God, even though he had proven otherwise. But he didn't care. He just wanted to share his knowledge with the world. When Ben was 27, he joined a group of scientists and inventors called the American Philosophical Society. They met regularly to discuss their latest discoveries and inventions. Some of the other members of this society were John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison, all of whom would go on to help found the United States of America. Now, it wasn't all fun and games. There was a lot of arguing and fighting among the members of this society, especially about electricity. See, Ben Franklin wasn't the only one who was interested in electricity. There was another guy named Ewald Custis, who was a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. Custis was also experimenting with electricity, but he believed that Ben Franklin was stealing his ideas. The truth was that both men were making valuable contributions to the field of electricity, but neither one would give the other credit. Instead, they spent their time arguing and trying to outdo one another. And it wasn't just in the scientific community that there was so much conflict. It was everywhere. The colonies were on the verge of revolution, and people were divided over whether or not they should break away from British rule. Some people, like John Hancock and Samuel Adams, wanted independence. Others, like John Dickinson and Thomas Hutchinson, wanted to stay loyal to the king. The disagreement was so intense that people were willing to fight and die over it. During this time of turmoil and uncertainty, one thing was certain. Ben Franklin was a hero to many people. He had helped them understand electricity and how to harness its power. He had invented things that made their lives easier and safer, and he had stood up against the British and fought for their rights. Now, remember, Ben Franklin was no saint. He was a flawed man who sometimes did bad things. But despite his flaws, he was a hero to many people. In our next episode, we'll learn about Chapter 4, Young Benjamin Franklin, A Curious Mind. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and leave a comment below to let me know what you think. Also, check out the links in the description for more great resources on the life of Benjamin Franklin. And finally, don't forget to tune in next time for more adventures of Benjamin Franklin. In the early 1750s, showing off electricity tricks became a fashionable entertainment in the drawing rooms of French salons and in the parlors of London. People paid admission for these shows by bringing a cat or dog and then feeding it to the lions. Benjamin Franklin was visiting London in 1751 when a friend challenged him to an electrical duel. This was after he'd heard about a young woman in Paris who was attracting crowds by shocking people with a Leyden jar. Now, the way this worked was that you could charge up a glass jar filled with water by rubbing it with a piece of fur, just like you could charge up a comb by rubbing it through your hair. But instead of using the charged comb to pick up bits of paper, the Parisians used it to give people small electric shocks. The idea caught on immediately. It became the height of fashion for wealthy young ladies to be shocked in public. And at $354 a single shock, it was quite a profitable business for the woman who started it. Now, when Franklin arrived in London, he had never seen such a thing, and so his friend thought it would be fun to introduce him to the phenomenon. But what they did was not so fun. As onlookers, they watched the woman charge up her jar. Then she placed 2 pointed metal rods inside. She attached a silk cord to one of them. Then she hid behind a screen and dangled the other one out for Franklin to grab. He reached out and touched it, and immediately got a horrible jolt. He later described it as being the most painful shock he ever felt, and it was all because she put too much charge into a jar. It was so bad that it left a numbness around his entire right side for hours. So needless to say, Franklin decided to investigate this further. His friend introduced him to Peter Collinson, a linen merchant who also doubled as a collector of scientific equipment. He owned the only electrical machine in London. This was a device used to generate static electricity. It consisted of a large glass sphere mounted on an axle and surrounded by a metal dome. To generate electricity, someone would rub the sphere with a hand or a cloth. Then, when the sphere was removed from under the dome, the built-up electricity would jump between the two and make sparks. And while this was impressive, it wasn't nearly as fun as watching people get zapped with a Leyden jar. So that's why Collinson also bought one of those. Then he invited Franklin over to his home for a demonstration. They charged it up, and then Collinson asked Franklin if he wanted to try it. Now he knew it would unhurt him too badly, because women were the ones who always got hurt. But he didn't warn Franklin about that. So when Franklin reached in to grab the rod, he got shocked again. And this time he was even more mad because he'd been lied to. He demanded to see it done first, but Collinson refused. This is what he wrote to a friend about it. I took the shock very good-naturedly, considering it as a necessary evil, the price one must sometimes pay for the advancement of science. However, my companion would do otherwise. He absolutely refused to show me the shock till I had first received it, saying it was impossible to explain how it happened, and therefore I must first see, and then I should understand it better. But I insisted to see it in a plate of metal, which he did, and it went off. After their disagreement, Franklin purchased his own electrical machine in a Leyden jar, and before long, he was giving demonstrations of electricity to anyone who would watch. One night he was doing this in his bedroom, because he didn't have a proper place to show it off. His wife, Deborah, walked in while he was holding a charged piece of wire. He accidentally dropped it on her and gave her a nasty shock. She screamed, and he panicked, thinking that he had killed her. When he looked down, her face was pale, but she seemed okay. So he kept on experimenting until finally she regained consciousness and asked what was going on. He told her what he was doing, and she replied, "Well, then let us see a little of it." She got a mild shock from the lye jar, and after that, she admitted that she would rather not see any more. Franklin continued to study electricity, and in 1753, he published his famous account of a kite and a key experiment, even though he didn't know it yet. This discovery launched him on the path to becoming one of the founding fathers of electrical science. But how did he come across electricity in the first place? Well, in the previous chapter, we learned that he had gotten interested in mechanical inventions after reading books by the inventor John Thief. He explained how machines could be powered by springs and wheels and pins and levers, and those principles could be applied to all sorts of different devices. But it turned out that one principle was missing. There was a whole category of machines that de Sagoliel hadn't talked about at all, and that was machines that used electricity. The first book Franklin found on the subject was called The Experimenter's Companion, or The Young Electrician, by a scientist named John Henry Lambert. He described how to build a simple electrical machine using glass and wool, and how to use it to make sparks. It also showed how to make a Leyden jar, and how to use that to give people electric shocks. Now, unfortunately, the book also contained a lot of nonsense, such as instructions on how to create artificial lightning, or how to use electricity to improve the flavor of beer. So it wasn't exactly clear which parts were real science and which parts were fake. But, fortunately for Franklin, there was another book available that cut through all the useless stuff, and that was The Whole Art of Electricity Illustrated, by a man named John Watson. It was based on the lectures given by a professor at Edinburgh University. So what did Franklin learn from these books? First, he discovered something called the law of primes, which states that electricity only flows through pointed objects. This was demonstrated by placing two uncharged rods next to each other. If one of them was blunt, nothing happened. But if it was sharp, then electricity would jump over and charge it up. Second, he learned that electricity could be transferred through wires. You could charge up a rod by touching it to an electrified surface. Then, if you connected that rod to another one using a string or thread, the charge would jump across, and the second rod would become charged as well. Third, he discovered that glass and wool were not the only materials that could generate electricity. By rubbing different substances together, he was able to generate sparks using things like amber and silk, or sugar and linen. Fourth, he learned that if you created enough electricity, it could travel through the air and form lightning bolts. In fact, the electricity generated by a simple machine could be strong enough to charge up a large object like a cannonball. So with all that knowledge, we might assume that he was ready to conduct his first experiment. But that wasn't the case. See, his biggest problem was that he didn't know who to ask for help. Remember, he was a printer, not a scientist. He didn't know any scientists, and the people he did know, like John Bartram, thought that electricity was a bunch of nonsense. So Franklin was stuck trying to figure this out on his own. But that changed when he got a letter from a man named Peter Collinson. It was 1752, and Collinson was a linen merchant living in London. His family had made a fortune selling linen cloth, so he didn't need to work. He spent his time collecting scientific instruments and dabbling in electrical experiments. When he learned that Franklin was in London, he sent him a letter asking if he could come over and see his electrical machine. But that never happened, because Franklin returned to Philadelphia before Collinson's invitation arrived. Instead, they began corresponding through letters, and they started talking about electricity. Collinson sent Franklin some electrical components, including a Leyden jar. This was the same device that would eventually shock poor Mrs. Franklin. But that didn't happen right away. For years, the two men continued exchanging ideas about electricity, and they set up a system where they would send each other equipment to test. Franklin invented a new type of Leyden jar that could store twice as much electricity. He also invented the lightning rod. And throughout it all, Collinson supplied him with equipment and encouraged him to keep on learning. Today, we remember Franklin as one of the greatest scientists of all time. But back then, it wasn't easy to find a mentor who could guide him. Sometimes it takes just one good friend to change the course of history. Thank you for watching this episode. I hope you learned something about electricity or maybe something about writing history. It's hard to believe that Benjamin Franklin was once a nobody who knew nothing about science. It's proof that anyone can achieve anything. All it takes is curiosity and dedication. If you want to support this series, you can subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching. This is Chapter 5 of A Short History of Electricity. In this chapter, we were going to see how Franklin went from being a printer and a civic leader to being a scientist who was feared and respected by some of the greatest scientific minds in Europe. If you liked this video, please subscribe and check out my others for more fun science history. And if you have comments or suggestions, please put them below. So at the beginning of Chapter 4, we left Franklin working as a printer in Philadelphia. He was also becoming quite active in local politics. But during 1748 and 1749, he began to attend the American Philosophical Society meetings. The APS was founded by a group of natural philosophers, people who were interested in science before it was called that, and it would meet regularly to discuss topics and experiments of interest. In attendance were men like John Bartram, a botanist who had collected specimens in the New World and was sending them back to Europe to be identified. There was also scientist and inventor James Loga and Thomas Godfrey, who had recently invented a quadrant for measuring altitudes at sea. These men were doing things that were very new and different, and they inspired Franklin to try something new and different himself. He was elected to the Alps in 1749, which gave him an excuse to meet with these interesting men regularly. In 1750, the Alps sent Franklin to Barbados to measure a solar eclipse. He spent about 4 months there and returned with many notes on the island's natural history. This was the start of Franklin's career as a philosopher, or natural philosopher, as they were called then. He published a description of Barbados in 1751, along with a letter to Peter Collinson in London describing his work there and some experiments he'd done with electricity. Those letters were the first publication of what would become his most famous work, Experiments and Observations on Electricity. It was typical for scientists of the time to share their results through letters, because most of them didn't publish their own original research, and so this book wasn't really a book at all, but rather 26 letters that Franklin had written between 1736 and 1752. Various friends in England. The title page explained that the letters covered experiments that had been performed in America and the West Indies relating to electricity, lightning, magnetism, and other natural phenomena. The work was divided into 3 parts, the first on electricity, the second on lightning, and the third on other matters. Part 1 covered everything from simple experiments like bringing a charged amber rod near a small piece of gold wire and seeing it jump toward the rod to a demonstration of how the electrical charge could be conducted through a wire and used to discharge a Leyden jar. It also described a way to charge a jar by rubbing it with a woolen cloth, while holding a metal point near the top. This became known as the prime-the-pump method and was used for decades to generate electricity, until people understood the concept of induction. It also included Franklin's famous Kite experiment, which demonstrated that lightning was connected to electricity. Part 2 detailed Franklin's thoughts on lightning rods, and pointed out that if lightning is electrical, then it can be conducted away safely through a wire. He recommended attaching a conductor to the top of buildings, and suggested pointing it toward the ground to dissipate the charge as quickly as possible. He also suggested wrapping the houses of ships in copper to protect them from lightning damage. Some critics said that such devices wouldn't work because no charge could possibly travel down a wire. They were wrong, but at the time there was no way to prove them otherwise. The third part contains several experiments on magnetism, including variations of the famous compass rose experiment, where a glass tube can be made magnetic by rubbing it with a silk handkerchief and used to attract small pieces of iron. Franklin tested how much heat was required to demagnetize the tube and found that a lot of heat was needed. He also explored the relationship between electrical charge and the attraction and repulsion of small pieces of pith. His explanation for the force of electrical attraction and repulsion was that a charged object has an aura or sphere of influence around it, and when an object enters that sphere, it is repelled. When the charged object is removed, another object can enter the space and be attracted to where the first one had been. This concept of an electrical aura was later called the field by Michael Faraday. So although Franklin was sometimes mocked for what he wrote, even his opponents praised his clear writing style and extensive experimentation. And it was his clear writing style that helped him get into hot water with the Royal Society, the preeminent scientific organization in England. In 1753, they had rejected his proposal to attach a wire to the steeple of St. Paul's Cathedral to test his lightning rod idea. Instead, they wanted him to do experiments with electricity in a controlled environment. That led Franklin to write his 1753 paper on electricity to the Royal Society. The members thought it was a good paper and invited him to come to London and present it to them in person. Naturally, Franklin was very excited about the prospect of being recognized by the Royal Society, but he turned it down because it would cost him his entire fortune to get there. So instead, they asked George Whately, a young English scientist, to go to America to collect the data himself. But when Whately tried to replicate Franklin's experiments, he couldn't get them to work. So he accused Franklin of faking his results. When Franklin learned of the accusation, he wrote a strongly worded letter defending himself and explaining why the experiments failed in England. He pointed out that it was impossible to duplicate natural phenomena, and that English observers had seen electrical sparks in clear, dry weather, which indicated that the electricity in England was stronger than in America. Franklin ended the letter by saying, "Give me the wriggles, and I will show you experiments." So in 1754, he published an account of his experiments with electricity, including the ones that Whately had failed to replicate. In it, he showed that they did indeed require damp air. He also published his famous list of 12 electrical laws, which included some of the basic principles of electricity. They were based on the results of his own experiments and those of others that he had read about. Some of the laws were incorrect or incomplete, but many stood the test of time. For example, Law No. 6 stated that things electrified by friction are not so much as by contact. Law 9 stated that no body can be electrified by induction but by the contact of another body electrified. And Law 11 declared that metals mutually unfix the electric fire and each keeps its own. Many of these laws remained in use for over 100 years. Franklin was able to publish his findings because of the support of a friend, Peter Collinson, who ran a printing press in London. It was through Collinson that Franklin met many of the important scientists in England. Collinson believed that electricity was a branch of natural philosophy worth studying and shared Franklin's belief that electricity and lightning were related. He owned one of the first electroscopes ever built and kept up with Franklin's work. And it was Collinson who sent a manuscript of Franklin's work to the French Academy of Sciences. At this time, France was experiencing a revolution in scientific thinking and discovery. The Royal Society in England was full of bickering and arguments, and had UNT published anything new for nearly 30 years. But in France, the atmosphere was completely different. The Paris Academy of Sciences was made up of brilliant young scientists who worked together without infighting and published groundbreaking discoveries. They already knew that electricity and magnetism were connected and were looking for evidence to confirm their theories. And when they received Franklin's paper, they were ecstatic. Although it was written in English, one of the members translated it into French and presented it at a meeting. After the reading, there was a great deal of applause. It was the start of Franklin's rise to fame in Europe, and would set the stage for his meeting with some of the greatest scientists of the age. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please subscribe and leave your comments below. I'll see you next time. Benjamin Franklin was a very busy man, so it's understandable if you find yourself yelling at your screen right now. Like, Get to the point already. But Yurigon now want to hear me out, because what happens next is both beautiful and tragic. We left off with Ben and his friends in the middle of a thunderstorm trying to figure out how to get some of that sweet lightning juice. And Ben had a great idea. Use a church steeple or some other tall tower as an antenna to attract the lightning, and then hook some sort of electrical device up to it to capture the electricity when the lightning struck. The problem was finding the right structure proved difficult. You see, there are two main problems with using a church steeple or a tall tower to try and catch lightning. The first problem is simply finding one, and we know from experience that not all buildings are created equal in terms of attracting lightning strikes. Tall, pointy things, like church steeples, domes, and masts, are much more likely to be struck by lightning than other types of buildings or objects. Because of this, they're often used as lightning rods, which means they were exactly what Franklin was looking for. Unfortunately, in Philadelphia, churches with steeples were few and far between, and none were close enough to where the group was watching the storm. Most people who could afford to build their own homes had them built from brick or stone, which don't conduct electricity as well as wood, which meant they weren't as likely to be struck by lightning. In fact, most of the houses in Philadelphia were made out of wood, so even if they had been able to find a tall wooden building, it still may not have been struck by lightning. It just so happened that none of these buildings were close enough to where they were watching the storm anyway. The second problem is that even if they had found a tall wooden building like a church or a lighthouse, getting access to its roof would have been nearly impossible during a raging thunderstorm. As we've said before, Franklin and his crew were trying to perform this experiment in the middle of a thunderstorm. You can't really wait around for the lightning to strike when the lightning is striking all around you. That was why Ben had brought his friend George to this particular location. George was a rope maker who lived close by, and he had agreed to help Franklin with his experiment. But George wasn't much help when it came to coming up with new ideas. He was only there to help set up whatever apparatus Ben came up with. In fact, George hadn't even wanted to come along at all, but Ben had insisted. And now, Ben wished he'd listened to George's protests. As the storm raged around them, Ben sat down on a nearby tree stump and pulled out a piece of paper and a pencil, and began sketching out some ideas. What if he didn't try to bring the lightning down to him? What if instead he took the electricity from the lightning and brought it to the ground? The idea hit him like a bolt from the blue. Why not use a kite to bring the electricity down? The kite would act as an antenna to attract the lightning. And then all they have to do is attach a way to collect the electricity to the strings. But how to collect the electricity? He thought about using something sharp, like a metal nail, to pierce the damp string and collect the electricity that way, but decided against it. Then he remembered the key he'd brought with him and smiled. A key would be much easier to attach to a string, and it would unrust like a nail would. Perfect. But Ben knew that his success depended on picking the right materials for the kite. If the kite didn't conduct the electricity properly, the lightning would just pass through it and not into his collecting device. At the same time, though, he didn't want something that would conduct electricity too well. Otherwise, the electricity would travel through the kite string and not through his key. Ben had a lot of experience with kites, so he knew that silk was the best material for the body of the kite. Silk was naturally insulating, which meant it wouldn't conduct electricity very well. Perfect. But that also meant that Ben would have to make sure to add extra points of contact between the kite and the string in order to draw the electricity through his key. This would ensure that the electricity traveled through the string and not through the kite itself. For the string, Ben needed something strong enough to hold the lightweight kite aloft in high winds, yet conductive enough to carry electricity. Hemp was the perfect solution. Finally, the key was made out of metal, the best conductor of electricity, but also the most dangerous. Ben knew that if he didn't insulate the key somehow, the electricity would travel through it and not through the string. But Ben had just the thing. Before he left home, he'd wound some silk thread around the handle of the key, leaving just the metal shaft exposed. Now the key was ready. All that was left was for Ben to construct the kite and attach the key. But how should he do it? How could he possibly attach a key to a silk kite string without damaging it? He thought about wrapping the string around the key, but quickly discarded the idea. The friction from rubbing against each other would eventually damage the string and ruin the whole experiment. Then Ben had a brainwave. What if he put a small piece of silk between the string and the key? This would allow the electricity to pass through the key while keeping the string safe. He cut a small square of silk and tied it onto the string next to the key. Then he did the same on the other side. Hust stubi sure. He adjusted the strings until the key hung perfectly centered on the kite string. Satisfied, Ben secured a string to the kite and cast it out into the wind. Up it went, floating higher and higher above the treetops. All that was left was to wait for a lightning strike. And wait, they did. But it seemed like the storm was going on forever. Just when their hopes were beginning to dwindle, a bolt of lightning split the sky and cracked thunder shook the ground. The key began to glow, and when the light faded, they saw that something amazing had happened. There was a small spark where the string was tied to the kite. Not only that, but the ends of the strings had begun to smoke. Apparently, the electricity was traveling from the kite to the string to the key and back again. And as the strings smoked, it became clear that the electricity was traveling through the key and back down into the ground. Franklin and his friends stood there in awe as the kite danced in the wind, bringing the lightning down to earth. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. Electricity from the lightning, captured safely by the kite, traveling down the string to the key and then into the ground. Ben quickly unhooked the key from the string and handed it to his friend George, who was so shocked he dropped the key. The key landed on the ground with a soft thud and immediately began smoking. But George was so stunned, he didn't move to pick it up. Instead, he watched in amazement as the key glowed brighter and brighter until suddenly it sparked and the air around it crackled with electricity. Startled, George dropped the key again and stumbled backwards. But it was too late. The second that the key touched the ground, the electricity surged through George's body, knocking him to the ground. Franklin rushed to George's side and helped him sit up. George was dazed and confused, but otherwise unharmed. He looked at the key in his hand and then at Franklin and whispered, "What have I done?" George's question echoed in Franklin's ears. Long after he and his friends had packed up their equipment and gone home, he had unlocked the secrets of electricity. But at what cost? Now, Chapter 7 of the Tale of Benjamin Franklin. And this is called The Storm Approaches. And it's an exciting chapter because we've been building towards it for some time now. The weather has been behaving very oddly here in Philadelphia. We've had some thunderstorms, and there's another one coming tomorrow. Or rather, later today. Really, as the clock strikes 11. But there's going to be a thunderstorm, and Franklin has a decision to make. He's going to go out in his kite. But should he bring someone along? Should he bring his son? Well, that's what we're going to find out right now in Chapter 7. As twilight deepened into night, the wind began to rise and the sky grew darker and darker. Heavy drops of rain fell, and soon the thunder began to rumble in the distance like the growl of some mighty beast. It was plain to see that the approaching storm would be a violent one. Benjamin Franklin, having finished his chores for the evening, stood at the doorway leading to his garden, watching the ominous clouds gather overhead. Beside him stood his eldest son, William, a lad of 14 summers, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. The sight of a thunderstorm always filled the boy with a strange sense of wonder. "Father, may I not go with you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper above the rising wind. "You know the rules, William," Franklin replied, his tone firm, yet gentle. "A man of science does not allow his curiosity to overcome his common sense. Remember what I have taught you about the dangers of standing in a storm with a kite. A direct hit from lightning could be fatal." William's shoulders slumped, his lower lip trembling ever so slightly. He knew his father was right, yet he couldn't help but long to be part of his father's daring adventures. As the first flash of lightning split the sky, illuminating the angry clouds above them, William's heart pounded in his chest. Franklin, seeing the turmoil in his son's eyes, felt a pang of sympathy. He knew how headstrong and inquisitive his son could be, often following him around the shop, peppering him with questions about his experiments. At times like these, Franklin wished he had someone to assist him. Someone who could help with the setup and take measurements, while he focused on his observations. But alas, the risks were too great. He turned back to the gathering darkness, lost in thought. Suddenly, an idea struck him like a bolt from the blue. Why not bring William along? Of course, the boy would need guidance and supervision, but perhaps this experience could be a valuable lesson, a chance to instill in his son the importance of both curiosity and caution. Turning back to William, a smile slowly spread across Franklin's face. "I have an idea," he said, his voice now filled with excitement. "Why don't you stay with me tonight, William? You can assist me with my observations, and we'll take all necessary precautions." William's face lit up like a Christmas tree, his earlier disappointment forgotten. "Really, Father?" he exclaimed, his eyes shining with gratitude and excitement. "But won't it be dangerous?" he added, his voice dropping to a worried whisper. "It may be an adventure, son, but danger is only what you make it," Franklin replied, placing a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "Now go and get some rest. We'll start early in the morning." As the storm raged outside, tossing the branches of trees against the window panes, Benjamin Franklin and his young son, William, lay tucked under blankets in a small room on the top floor of their home. Outside, the wind howled like a hungry wolf, and the thunder roared its defiance. Every flash of lightning illuminated not only the raging storm, but also the anxious faces of the two men who watched it from their sheltered room. Franklin, unable to sleep, sat propped up against pillows, his gaze fixed on the window. His mind raced, calculating the best time to venture out. William, his head resting on his father's blanket, pretended to be asleep, but his ears were attuned to every sound, every creak of the house. Every gust of wind sent shivers down his spine. As the first hint of dawn peeked through the curtains, Franklin rose from his makeshift bed. He dressed quickly, pulling on his oilskin coat, the same one he used during his experiments. Turning to William, he saw that his son had already risen. Young William, though still sleepy-eyed, stood proudly, his own small coat pulled tight against the chill of the morning. "Are you sure about this, Father?" William asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Of course," Franklin replied, his tone firm yet gentle. "We must be brave, William. Remember, it's only dangerous if we make it so. Now, come along." And they descended the stairs, the floorboards groaning beneath their feet. The storm had reached its peak during the night, and now the winds seemed to be beginning their slow retreat. As they stepped outside, the air crackled with electricity, and the scent of ozone hung heavy. Before them, the sky was a bruised purple, heavy with moisture. Large drops of rain fell, drumming a steady rhythm on the rooftops. The trees swayed, their branches still bearing the marks of the storm's fury. In the distance, the rumble of thunder echoed like a fading giant's footsteps. Without a word, Franklin unfurled his kite, its tail streaming behind it like a colorful comet. With practiced ease, he attached the string to a pulley system, which was anchored to a hook in the corner of the house. William, his eyes wide with anticipation, stood by, ready to help. "Remember, son," Franklin said, his voice grave, "if the rain turns to a downpour or the lightning strikes too close, we are to come inside immediately." "Understood," William nodded, his throat too dry to speak. He knew better than to answer with anything but the utmost seriousness. When his father spoke of his experiments, Franklin took a deep breath, bracing himself against the wind. With a final check of the kite, he gave the signal. William, his small frame swallowed by his coat, pulled in the slack of the string, his fingers white with effort. Franklin, his eyes scanning the horizon, started to move away from the house, walking slowly at first, then with growing confidence. As the minutes passed, the kite sailed higher and higher, its tail whipping in the wind like a proud bird in flight. The rain, which had been falling steadily, suddenly intensified, turning into a torrent that soaked Franklin to the bone within seconds. But he didn't flinch. He continued his walk, his eyes fixed on the kite. William, his small hands now slicked with water, kept a tight grip on the string. He watched as his father approached the edge of the clearing. There, in the open field, the kite was truly free, dancing in the wind like a creature of pure joy. Franklin stopped, and for a moment, father and son stood in silence, united in their shared wonder. The storm, though fierce, had become a spectacle of beauty, and the threat of danger had faded into the background. But the storm was not over yet, as Franklin and his son would soon learn, and to find out how they escaped certain death. You'll have to tune in next time for part 2 of Chapter 7, where we discover just how close they were to death itself. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Adventures of Benjamin Franklin, brought to you by the Electric Company. If you enjoyed this story, please feel free to give us a thumbs up leave us a comment, and click the subscribe button so you never miss an exciting episode. This is our channel. We hope you're having a great day wherever you are. Goodbye. It was getting dark. Clouds were rolling in, but young Franklin was not deterred. He had something to do before the storm hit. He ran to his room and grabbed his kite, made from a silk handkerchief. With all his might, he launched it into the air, up into the darkening clouds. The wind snatched at the loose strings in his hands, and as it rose higher and higher, the wind grew stronger, tugging at the string until it was almost out of his grasp. But he held on tight, and then suddenly, just as quickly as it started, the wind vanished. The line went slack. The kite hung motionless in the sky, suspended in the gathering gloom like a dead bird. Now, usually, this would be the end of it. The storm would come and rip the kite to shreds, or the wind would change direction and send it plummeting to the ground. But today was no ordinary day. This was the day that Ben Franklin was going to teach his son the most important lesson of his life. The clouds rumbled overhead, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall. They splashed on the silk kite, and some of the water trickled down its long nose. At first, there was no reaction from the string. It hung limp and lifeless in the air, just like any other day. But as the rain continued to fall, the string slowly began to change. Its loose fibers began to stand on end, pulled upward by invisible forces. And as they rose, a faint electric spark jumped between them, a tiny blue flame that danced in the gathering darkness. At first, the spark was almost invisible, just a fleeting glimpse of something strange and wonderful. But then it grew larger, brighter, more defined, and as it arced between the fibers, it illuminated their path, making them visible for the first time. Little by little, the string came alive with electricity, becoming a channel through which the power of the storm could flow. At its base, the water dripped steadily from the end of the nose, forming a small pool at Franklin's feet. Inside this pool, tiny currents swirled, driven by the same electric forces that raised the strings above him. In the distance, thunder roared and lightning flashed, illuminating the wild dance of the string as it strained against the invisible forces that pulled it toward the sky. Ben Franklin watched it all with a mixture of fascination and fear. He knew that what he was witnessing was dangerous, unpredictable, and yet he couldn't look away. He stood there mesmerized as the storm raged around him, oblivious to everything but the electric spectacle before him. For a long time, nothing happened. Then suddenly, the string snapped. A loud crack echoed through the air and a bright flash lit up the sky. The broken string fell to the ground and lay there smoking. Young Franklin stared at it in disbelief. What had been so strong just a moment ago was now weak and lifeless. He looked up at the kite and saw that it too had changed. Its once proud form was now tattered and torn, the silk ripped and shredded by the invisible forces of the storm. As if to emphasize the fragility of their creation, the wind caught the kite and sent it tumbling toward the ground. It landed in a heap at Franklin's feet, another casualty of the storm. Franklin felt a pang of sadness as he looked at the ruined kite. It wasn't just a game to him. It was a symbol of his father's love and a reminder of the wonder and beauty of the natural world. He looked up at the dark clouds and the raging storm and wondered if it was all worth it. Was it worth risking everything to unlock the secrets of the sky? Ben Franklin knelt down beside his son and put a hand on his shoulder. He knew what it was like to be young and full of wonder, to look up at the sky and dream of what might be possible. He had been there once too, and he knew that his son's dreams were just beginning. He didn't say anything. There was no need to. His son already knew that what they had done was dangerous, but also that it was necessary. The storm had to happen. The kite had to break. Only then could they learn the secrets of the sky. Together, father and son stood in the rain and watched the storm pass. When it was over, the clouds parted and the sun came out. The air was fresh and clean, and the world seemed new again. Franklin looked at his son and smiled. It was a small smile, but it was enough. It was the only acknowledgement they needed of what they had done together. They didn't need to talk about it. They didn't need to explain it. They both knew that they had been part of something bigger than themselves, something that had the power to change the world. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Franklin took his son's hand and led him away from the wreckage of their kite. They walked side by side, two figures silhouetted against the light, their backs to the camera. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the silence, a steady beat that marked the passing of time. The camera followed them as they walked, keeping them in frame, a testament to their bond. The image of the broken kite, tattered and torn, remained on the screen, a reminder of the fragility of human endeavor. But even in its destruction, there was a sense of beauty, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is always hope for a new beginning. And then, as if to underscore the cyclical nature of life, the camera panned away from the wreckage and focused on the sky. The clouds were parting and the sun was shining through, casting a golden glow on the landscape. It was a new day, a fresh start, a chance to try again. And in that moment, there was a sense of optimism, a belief in the possibility of renewal, a quiet confidence that even in the face of adversity, life goes on. After a while, young Franklin spoke. His voice was small at first, but it grew stronger with each word. "Father, can we try again tomorrow?" he asked. "Can we make a bigger kite and fly it higher?" Franklin smiled. "Of course, my boy," he said. "We will make a bigger kite and fly it higher." And as the sun climbed higher in the sky, father and son walked on, their heads bent in concentration, already planning their next move. The storm had passed and the future was theirs to shape. They reached a clearing and stopped. In front of them was a large, open field, perfect for flying a kite. They spread out the material for the new kite, and Franklin showed his son how to make the most of the silk. As they worked, Franklin talked about the importance of being prepared, of taking the time to do things right. He showed his son how to make sure the string was strong and the frame was sturdy. When they were finished, the kite was huge, a magnificent thing that towered over them like a giant bird. Young Franklin looked at it in awe. "It's beautiful, father," he whispered. Franklin nodded. "It is," he agreed. "But beauty is not enough. We must make sure it's strong, that it can withstand the winds of fate." Together, they launched the kite into the sky. It soared high above them, its tail streaming behind it like a banner. As it climbed higher and higher, the wind grew stronger, tugging at the string. Franklin held on tight, his knuckles white. "Don't be afraid," he said, his voice calm and steady. "The kite wants to fly, and we will let it go." With a deep breath, he released the string. The kite went sailing away, disappearing into the vast expanse of blue. For a moment, there was silence. Then Franklin and his son burst into cheers. That kite was flying, free and untethered, dancing in the wind like a creature of pure joy. Franklin watched as his son laughed and shouted, his face upturned toward the sky. In that moment, there was nothing more important than this, nothing more real. The kite dipped and swayed, but it stayed aloft, and as the sun began to set, it turned a brilliant shade of red, a fitting end to a perfect day. Franklin and his son stood together, side by side, watching the kite, until it was nothing but a distant speck in the sky. And when it was gone, they knew that they would never forget this day, the day they let their kite fly. It's time for another installment of 1800's Manvies. Wild Where Man definitely does not beat wild. Join me as we read about Franklin S. Kite, experiment from the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, by Benjamin Franklin himself. Previous. In our last episode, Ben put 2 people in stocks and then paraded them through the streets like an idiot. And now he wants to find out if lightning is actually electricity or just some kind of weird, dangerous magic. He decides the best way to test this is to fly a kite during a thunderstorm, which is obviously the most dangerous thing anyone has ever done and will probably kill him for sure. But before he gets the hang of it, there's someone else who wants to try their luck first. Franklin's friend, David Halloran, who was an electrician and really wanted to be a scientist, tried flying a kite in a storm when he was in France, but the kite got caught in the clouds and never came back down. When he cut the string, the cloud immediately dissipated. So maybe that wasn't such a great sign. After hearing about this story, Franklin decides to give it a go himself, but he's going to do it his own way. It's a beautiful summer day, and a storm is brewing off in the distance. Now's my chance, he thinks. He rushes out, grabs his kite, and flies it in the direction of the storm. A few moments later, a flash of lightning illuminates the sky, and Franklin sees a cloud right above him. Then he feels something brush against his leg. Startled, he looks down to see the string of his kite wrapped around his foot, and at the same moment, a bolt of lightning strikes the very top of his kite. Thankfully, it did not hit Franklin directly. Instead, it seems to have flowed into the string and down the length of it until it reached his foot. There, it went through his leather shoe, up his leg, across his stomach, and finally out through his other leg. Luckily, he's wearing a rubber-soled shoe. Otherwise, the electricity might have traveled through his whole body and killed him. So, good thing he wore those. He confirms that what he felt was electricity. And how did he figure that out? Well, as soon as the lightning struck the kite, he began to violently shake, uncontrollably. His face flushed red with pain, and he could hear nothing but a loud ringing in his ears. He continued to shake until all the electricity left his body. At that point, he was completely drained of energy and collapsed to his knees. But after a couple minutes, he was back on his feet and ready to try again. Franklin continued to fly his kite in the middle of the storm, occasionally getting zapped by smaller bolts of lightning. Every time he got shocked, his body would begin to tremble. However, he noticed that the more times he got struck, the less intense each shock was, and eventually they became so mild that he didn't even feel them anymore. Franklin realized that each time he was struck, some of the electricity was staying inside of him. And so after being hit by many bolts of lightning, he became immune to them. So with his body now charged with electricity, Franklin decided to prove once and for all that lightning was just electrical charge. He stuck a key to the end of a string and dangled it near the top of his kite. Then he focused his entire attention on the key and imagined it being attracted to the top of the kite by some invisible force. And lo and behold, the key began to move towards the kite. Once it was close enough, Franklin touched the key with his finger. He could feel electricity surging through his body and heard a popping sound. When he looked at his finger, it had become slightly singed. Finally, Franklin had irrefutable proof that lightning was electricity, and because of this discovery, he was able to invent lightning rods, which have saved countless lives. I don't know why, but this story always cracks me up. Honestly, it sounds like a bad joke, like someone says, "Hey Ben, what's the best way to find out if lightning is electricity?" And Ben responds, "Well, duh, you get struck by lightning." And everyone's like, "Oh, yeah, makes sense." And then he proceeds to get struck by lightning multiple times. Seriously, this guy had every reason to be terrified, and I think it would have been reasonable for him to drop the kite and run away as soon as he saw a flash of lightning. But instead, he gambled with his life and decided to stick it out and ride it out, so to speak. And when he saw the string wrapped around his foot, he should have panicked. He had a choice in that moment to either keep holding the string and take the full force of the lightning bolt, or he could let go of the string and risk the bolt hitting the ground around him, potentially creating a fireball or starting a forest fire or something. But instead, he just froze. And whatever happened, happened. Also, it's worth noting that this was not the first time someone had attempted this experiment. In fact, a Russian professor named Georg Wilhelm Richmann tried to do the same thing 3 weeks earlier and was killed by a bolt of lightning. Poor guy. He was standing on a hill, trying to fly a kite in the middle of a storm when suddenly his house began to shake. He looked over to see a large cloud directly above him, illuminated by a bright flash of lightning. He then felt a strong current flow through his body, and everything went black. Turns out he got vaporized. Ouch. This was only the beginning of a long line of deadly experiments that scientists would perform to learn more about electricity. The next one will blow your mind. Stay tuned for Chapter 10, where we learn about the deadly consequences of messing with nature. Also, I want to take a moment to address something. You see, a while ago, I asked my subscribers what they wanted to see on the channel, and one of the top requested things was a breakdown of the famous trolley problem thought experiment. So, primera ma de italiano. And now I can't post it because the YouTube algorithm hates long-form philosophical discussions. So instead, I'll be releasing the video on my Patreon exclusively. In the meantime, here's a little sneak peek. This is the classic version of the trolley problem. A runaway trolley is headed down a track. If it continues on its current path, it will kill 5 people who are tied up on the tracks. You can divert the trolley onto another track where it will kill 1 person who has tied up there. Is it morally permissible to divert the trolley onto the second track? What about if you're the one tied up on the second track? Would you be okay with someone diverting the trolley onto your track and saving the 5 people? How about if you're the one in charge of the trolley? Say you're driving it, and you accidentally crash. Would you be okay with the trolley automatically diverting to a side track where it would kill 1 person instead of continuing forward where it would kill 5 people? Some people say yes and others say no. So is that. If you want to find out, then support the channel on Patreon and get access to the video. As always, I want to thank you all for watching and ask you to please subscribe. All the best, and see you next time. If you're enjoying this series and want to help us keep it free for everyone forever, please join our membership program today. In Chapter 9, we saw how Franklin set up his famous kite experiment to test his hypothesis that lightning was electrical in nature. And in the last moments of the experiment, he successfully flew his kite in the midst of a raging thunderstorm, proving once and for all that he was right. But with his hypothesis now confirmed, Franklin had one more thing to do before he could retire from this particular experiment, and that was to write up his results and get them published in a scientific journal. So in this chapter, we're going to see how Franklin wrote about his experiment and the effect that this had on his career. So let's get started. The first thing that I should note is that, unlike in the previous chapter, where everything is fictionalized and imagined from Franklin's perspective, this chapter is mostly based on real historical events. Sci-LLB using Franklin's own writings and accounts from those who knew him to tell this part of the story. Franklin's report of the experiment was published in a scientific journal called the American Philosophical Transactions. This was a publication of the American Philosophical Society, which was a group of natural philosophers, or what we would today call scientists, who met regularly to discuss their findings and research. They were founded in 1743 and are still around today as the American Philosophical Society for those who are interested. As for the paper itself, it was titled An Account of a New Electrical Machine, being a further improvement on the electrical organ by M.D.L. Rife. It seems odd to us today that Franklin would try to pass off lightning as an improvement to a machine when it was clearly a force of nature. But in the context of the time, this made perfect sense. At this point in history, electricity was not understood very well at all. There was no theory to explain how or why things worked. Scientists were just discovering new ways to generate and utilize electrical charge, and were also discovering all sorts of new electrical devices and experiments. As far as anyone knew, lightning was simply another one of these electrical devices. That was what the scientists of the time believed. And so that's how Franklin described it. He began by explaining how he had previously invented an electrical machine that was capable of producing sparks. He then went on to describe how the key difference between his machine and de la Rive's machine was that his machine produced sparks continuously, while de la Rive's machine required regular pumping to maintain the flow of electricity. Then, without warning, Franklin veered off on a completely different topic and discussed the properties of glass harmonica. He talked about how glass harmonica could produce musical tones, and even went so far as to explain how they did this. Again, this seems bizarre to us today, because it has nothing to do with the topic at hand. But again, remember that this was a time when scientists did not have any overarching theories connecting all of their discoveries. They were still figuring out the basic principles of electricity and how the various electrical devices worked. If something worked in some way, but you didn't know how, then you would just describe the phenomenon and move on to the next thing. You didn't have the ability to connect all of these isolated observations into a coherent whole, and so Franklin's discussion of glass harmonica may seem irrelevant. But he was actually trying to explain how electricity flowed through glass harmonica and resonated to produce sound. Basically, his goal was to explain how a particular electrical device worked. He was not yet aware that electricity could be used for anything else. Finally, Franklin got back to the topic at hand and described his kite experiment. He said that he flew the kite during a thunderstorm and that a piece of string was attached to the key to prevent it from escaping into the clouds. He then said that once the string became charged, he could have touched the key with his finger and killed himself. But instead he used a long stick with a hook on the end of it to retrieve the key without touching it. He said that after doing this several times, he unhooked the key and brought it down into the house. He then rubbed the key with a dry cloth to discharge it, and once he did that, the sparks stopped. He concluded by saying that since he was able to use the key to attract sparks from other conductors, it proved that lightning was electrical in nature. Franklin then went on to speculate on the exact nature of lightning. He thought that lightning was produced by the separation of two electrical fluids, positive and negative, and that these fluids normally repelled each other, but that under certain conditions, such as during a thunderstorm, the fluids were drawn together and caused lightning. He also thought that the reason lightning followed the path of least Resistance was because it was attracted to objects that were made of materials that easily conducted electricity, such as metal. He ended his paper by suggesting that it might be possible to improve upon his machine even further, and that perhaps it might be possible to attract lightning directly to an object by making it the path of least resistance. Franklin submitted his paper to the American Philosophical Transactions on June 17, 1753, and it was published in the July issue. In it, he took credit for discovering the electrical nature of lightning, but he also gave credit to others who had helped him along the way, such as John Mitchell, who had suggested the experiment in the first place. Franklin was careful to share credit with others, because he understood that science was a collaborative effort, and that it was important to give credit where it was due. The publication of his paper made Franklin famous outside of New England. People all over the country wanted to meet the man who had discovered the electrical nature of lightning. Some people even came to Philadelphia specifically to watch Franklin perform his kite experiment, although he never repeated the experiment after his first try. For his part, Franklin was happy to share credit and to perform demonstrations of his experiment, but he was less than enthusiastic about being famous. In fact, he hated it. He once wrote to a friend, "I was never before so sensible of the weight of public opinion as in this instance. I never knew before what it was to have fame forced upon me." In the years following the publication of his paper, Franklin continued to work on electrical experiments and to spread the word about his discovery. He traveled all over the world representing the American Philosophical Society and giving lectures about his findings. In 1762, he was elected president of the society and served in that role for the rest of his life. Today, Franklin is remembered as one of the greatest American scientists of all time. His reputation was solidified after the publication of his paper on the electrical nature of lightning. It was this paper, more than any other single factor, that made him famous, both in America and Europe. It established him as a leading natural philosopher and helped to launch his career in science. Now, if you've been watching this series for a while, you may be wondering why it has taken me so long to get to this point in Franklin S.'s story. After all, most people know that Franklin discovered the electrical nature of lightning. Well, it's because I wanted to take my time and really explore the story behind that discovery. We spent a lot of time talking about Franklin, his thought process, and how he came up with his hypothesis. And we also spent a lot of time talking about the details of the experiment and how he designed and built his equipment. But now that we've finally reached the end of the story, I can start to wrap things up and bring this series to a close. Over the next few chapters, we'll see how Franklin used his newfound fame to launch his career in science. We'll also see how his work on electricity changed the world forever. So make sure to subscribe if you don't want to miss out on any of that. As always, I'd like to thank my patrons for their continued support. If you'd like to become a patron, you can do so today at our support page. You can also support us by making a one-time donation through the links in the description below. Finally, please don't forget to leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Reviews help to bring attention to our podcast, and they also help us to reach new audiences. So please take a minute to leave a review. It really does help us out a lot. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time. So in this chapter, we're going to be discussing Chapter 11, which is called Debates and Doubts. And so the questions that we are going to be answering in this chapter are, did Franklin really fly the kite during a thunderstorm, as the legend says? And does it matter if he didn't? Okay, so let's get started with our questions. So the first question is, did Franklin perform the experiment exactly as the legend says? And this is a question that many modern historians have asked. They've looked at Franklin's original notes, and they've compared them to what the story has become. And there are some discrepancies. So when we look at the legend, the story that most people know, it's that Franklin went out in a thunderstorm. He flew a kite with a key attached to it, and then he was struck by lightning but survived unscathed. But when we look at Franklin's original notes, there are some things that are different. First of all, the weather. So, yes, he did go out in a storm, but it doesn't say anything about thunderstorms. It just says storms. In fact, the very first sentence in his writing says, "in calm summer weather," which doesn't sound like a thunderstorm. So right away, there's a difference between the legend and what we actually read. Another discrepancy is that he doesn't actually mention flying a kite with a key on it. He mentions flying a kite, but nothing about the key. However, there is another source from around the same time that describes the experiment with the kite and the key, and that's a letter that Franklin wrote to a friend of his. And he says, "Yesterday, a thunder stormed. I went out into the street in a strong gust of wind and saw the clouds opening in a flash and heard the clap too late to retire. My son and I run out of the house to a field, and there we saw the rain pouring in torrents. We stood under the trees till it was spent. We then ran home again, my son William throwing a key at my door after me. On my asking what that was for, he said, to try if lightning would turn a key. So I took it up and observed that the whole of the bit near the head was a little eaten or corroded, and so was the upper part of the shank where it was tried on the keyhole. The rest was smooth and untarnished. From this we concluded that the electricity of the lightning operated on the metals only while it remained in a state of activity or heat, and that its power on the key ended with its heat. So this is pretty much the exact story that we're familiar with today. But again, it's not written by Franklin. It's a letter that Franklin wrote to a friend, and so it's possible that Franklin wasn't the one who performed the experiment. Maybe it was his son. Maybe he just observed the experiment. We don't really know. And so that brings us to the second question, which is, does it matter if he didn't? And I think the answer is no. It really doesn't matter. And here's why. So even if Franklin didn't conduct the experiment exactly as the legend says, it seems clear that he did conduct an experiment with a kite and a key, and he also seemed to believe that lightning was electricity, which wasn't the common belief at the time. People thought that lightning was produced by something called ballistae, which was a type of Greek weapon, and apparently it was believed that lightning was a projectile that was shot from clouds. And so Franklin's idea that lightning was electricity was revolutionary. And even if he didn't personally fly the kite with the key, his ideas were still the same, and it was his ideas that were important. In fact, there are other scientists who conducted the exact same experiment that's described in the legend. For example, one scientist repeated the experiment with a 40-foot kite, and they were successful in attracting lightning. So it seems like the experiment was possible and other scientists were able to do it. So if Franklin didn't do it, someone else did it. And either way, the important thing was that these scientists were able to prove that lightning was electricity. And once they proved that, then they were able to start experimenting with electricity more, and they developed many inventions and ideas that we still use today. I guess it kind of makes you wonder who really invented what. Like, we tend to give credit to Franklin for inventing bifocals and the lightning rod and the Franklin stove, but it turns out that a lot of his inventions weren't really his. For example, there's evidence that a slave named Mully invented the fireplace that became known as the Franklin stove, and Franklin took credit for it. And even though Franklin had the idea that lightning was electricity, there's evidence that other scientists had the same idea before him, but they just didn't write it down. So it's hard to say who really invented what. But in the case of lightning, I think it's safe to say that Franklin was the first one to propose it, even if he didn't prove it. I am gone. Now, go ahead and read you a couple quotes from the chapter that I found interesting, and then we'll finish up. The first one is, there is another class of facts which we can adduce in support of the probability that Franklin did not conduct the kite experiment, as it is popularly told. His notebooks contain numerous electrical experiments, and in none of them does he describe having been struck by lightning. I thought this was interesting because it says that all of Franklin's notes contain numerous electrical experiments, and he never writes about being struck by lightning. So this supports the idea that maybe he wasn't struck by lightning when he performed this experiment. And then later it says, but even if he did not experience the shock through his body, yet standing as he was in a metal-tipped kite flying apparatus, he might well have felt the electrical discharge pass through his arm and up his spine. And I thought this was interesting because it is saying even if Franklin didn't get shocked throughout his entire body, when he was holding the key, it's possible that the electricity passed through his arm and up his spine. So it's saying that he could have been shocked without getting killed. Ante interes. One last quote that I am going to read, and then we'll finish up. This one goes, if then the true account of the kite experiment is that of a scientific hypothesis successfully tested by others, it would seem that the confusion of the details arose from repeated trials and variations of the experiment. And this is interesting because it says that if Franklin did unperform the experiment, exactly how the legend says, then the legend grew over time as other scientists repeated the experiment, and they changed the details each time. And so that is how we ended up with this legend that doesn't quite match up with what actually happened. Alright, so that's everything that I wanted to talk about in this chapter. Again, this chapter is called Debates and Doubts. And basically it talks about the story of Franklin and the kite, and how it may not be exactly accurate. But regardless, Franklin's ideas were still important, and he helped us understand electricity better. Okay, so next time we're going to be doing Chapter 12, which is called Light Bulbs. So we'll see you next time. Bye. When you think of Benjamin Franklin, what comes to mind? Maybe his iconic kite tale, or maybe some wise saying like, early to bed. Early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. But have you ever thought about lightning rods? They're practically synonymous with thunderstorms. Whenever thunder roars, lightning rods cower. In reality, they were invented by none other than our dear Ben Franklin. And I mean he was just the first guy who thought to stick a rod up during a thunderstorm. I mean, he literally invented them. In this episode, we'll learn how one of the most practical scientific inventions came to be. Chapter 12, Lightning Rods. Benjamin Franklin was many things: postmaster, writer, statesman, inventor, scientist. It may not surprise you to learn that he also kept a journal, and in it he wrote down all sorts of ideas and observations, like this one from June 1752. A lightning struck the spire of a church near my house, and running down its outside, carried fire with it and set the upper part of the steeple on fire. The people in the street were much frightened and ran away, but I stood under the eaves of a house and saw the whole flame ascend from the steeple to the clouds, which appearance was so new and astonishing that it attracted more my attention than the shock itself, which was not very loud. That's right. This is the first recorded observation of a positively charged lightning strike. It's no secret that lightning strikes often originate from clouds, but back then that wasn't common knowledge. It was widely believed that lightning was produced by electrical charges within the ground, maybe from underground machaws, or friction between layers of rock. This idea had been around since ancient times, and persisted for centuries, because it was impossible to test. No one could bring themselves to do an experiment where they set off a lightning strike on purpose. I mean, they did try to ground lightning. People tried sticking metal rods into the ground facing upwards. This was based on the theory that lightning came from underground, so if you provided it a way out, it would escape through your rod instead of through your house. But these attempts failed, possibly because they were grounded upside down. It wasn't until modern technology came along that we realized the truth of lightning's origin. Now we know that electrostatic discharge from clouds is responsible for most lightning, and we know that thunder is the sound that accompanies this discharge. What we do know is why exactly those charges build up in the clouds in the first place. But back in Franklin's day, he got pretty close to describing the process. He correctly assumed that lightning originated from the clouds, but he couldn't prove it. So he came up with a demonstration, and we all know the story of that demonstration. You can even see the famous kite flying demonstration in old paintings of him, but it's probably not the story you're thinking of. That's a myth that started only 60 years after he died. Franklin never flew a kite during a storm. Instead, he attached a key to the end of a string and dangled it out of an open window during a storm. When it got struck by lightning, the key made a clicking sound as electricity flowed through it. After making sure that his house was properly grounded, Franklin repeated this a few times until finally he was convinced. Storms produce electrical charges, and lightning is the release of that energy. Okay, so he proved that storms produce electrical charges. Does that mean he discovered electricity? Not key. Ancient Greek philosophers had already observed static electricity by rubbing amber, and for the next millennia, scientists built upon that knowledge. Otto von Guericke invented the first electrostatic generator in 1660. And Stephen Gray discovered the difference between conductors and insulators in 1729. By the time Franklin came around, there was already quite a bit of knowledge available about electricity. He didn't invent it, but he did make a couple key discoveries about it. First, he realized that electricity could be both positive and negative. Prior to these people thought that lightning was always negatively charged. But Franklin realized that this was untrue by charging two glass tubes with electricity and bringing them near each other. Like magnets, they were attracted to each other, but they were repelled when he touched them together. He decided to call the charges positive and negative because they had an opposite effect. Today we know that there are actually 8 different types of electric charge, but at the time, identifying just 2 was a huge deal. He also described electric current in more detail and helped identify some safety precautions when working with electricity. For example, that you should avoid being in a room full of electrical conductors while handling electricity. And that advice has stuck with us to this day. If you've ever seen someone doing a science experiment where they're handling high-voltage electricity, you will all notice that they usually have a rubber glove on, or maybe their entire body is covered in rubber. That's to insulate them from the electricity. Just like Franklin said, no one wants to be in a room full of electrical conductors while handling electricity. And it was this unique insight into electricity that allowed him to invent the lightning rod. To reduce damage from lightning, he created a device to divert the electricity straight into the ground. At the time, the leading theories on lightning could not explain how to defend a building from lightning. But after all of Franklin's research and discovery, he realized that all you needed was a good conductor connected to the ground that would attract lightning away from the building. His first design consisted of a pointed rod made of copper mounted on top of a building and connected to the ground by a wire. As we know, lightning originates from the clouds, and that means tall pointed objects like spires and masts are the most likely to get struck. So, Franklin's design was brilliant. The copper rod attracted the lightning, and then the wire distributed the electricity into the ground before it could do any damage. This was a simple, yet elegant solution that has worked for centuries. He explained his invention in a letter to a friend, saying, "I've been looking on a spired steeple as a complete conductor. The lightning, when it comes, takes the path of least resistance to the ground. It is not so much the situation of the building that is to be regarded as the nature of the building. A pointed rod above the eye level of a man will be the best conductor." But unfortunately, not everyone was convinced. People were skeptical that lightning could even be attracted in this way. They knew that lightning was caused by the air around them getting electrically charged, but they didn't know the mechanism behind it. Most people believed that the air was somehow positively charged, so Franklin's positively charged lightning rods would repel lightning instead of attracting it. But Franklin was sure that he was correct. He wrote, "Thus we see that in thunderstorms, lightning and thunder are the effects of the sudden conversion of electrical fire into real fire, and the concussion produced by so vast a quantity of matter in its airy way, suddenly heated and electrified, and of the breaking and rending of the aerial and terrestrial fire, as it were, by its own internal heat and violence." Basically, he was saying that lightning and thunder happen when the air gets charged with electricity, which then releases a burst of energy and heats up the air around it so much that it makes a thunderclap. This is a much better explanation than what people had at the time. So he might have been onto something, but there was no way to prove it. So, for the sake of argument, let's say that Franklin was wrong. Would his lightning rods still work? The answer is yes. Even if the air isn't positively charged, the atmosphere still has enough ions around that lightning can jump between them. And a lightning rod provides the perfect path. So, despite people's skepticism, Franklin continued to defend his invention. Eventually, his reputation was enough to convince the leaders of Philadelphia to allow him to install a lightning rod on the state house later renamed Independence Hall. This is where the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were signed. He installed it in 1753, and ever since then, it has remained the oldest building in Philadelphia without a lightning rod. It hasn't been struck yet, and neither has the State House. The year before, an 8,000-ton British man-of-war ship called the Leeds Castle was anchored off the coast of Barbados. When a massive thunderstorm rolled in, it was struck by lightning and burned to the ground. But the next time a ship arrived in port, it had lightning rods installed and they never got struck again. Lightning rods are still used today, but they've improved since Franklin's time. They're now used on buildings, airplanes, oil derricks, telecommunication towers, and even inside electronic devices. Originally, they were designed to prevent fires, but now they're also used to protect against surges of electricity that can fry expensive equipment. Although Franklin's explanation of electricity was ultimately incorrect, his invention changed the world. Because of his insight, entire cities and ships are safe from lightning. And it goes to show that sometimes the most useful discoveries come from the simplest explanations. Thank you for watching till the end, and I'll see you next time. You may know Ben Franklin as the man who flew a kite during a thunderstorm and discovered that lightning is a form of electricity. But what else did he contribute to science? And how did his work inspire scientists across the globe for centuries to come? This is Chapter 13 of the series The Spark. When we think about Benjamin Franklin's legacy, we typically think about two things: his role in the American Revolution and his invention of bifocals. But if we're honest, we probably don't remember much about either of these things. We just have this vague sense that he was important. What we all do remember him for is that kite experiment from his youth. That's the story that captured our imagination. So first off, yes, Franklin did famously fly a kite in a thunderstorm. He was 26 years old and living in Philadelphia when he decided to put his ideas to the test. It seemed logical to him that since electricity attracted or repelled certain objects, it might be possible to attract lightning. All he needed to do was get close enough to the thunderclouds to make contact with them. So on a day in May when storms were raging outside, he grabbed a silk handkerchief, tied it to the end of a string, put a key at the other end, then sent it aloft into the clouds. And sure enough, when he let the string run out, he felt a shock run up his arm. Not only had he attracted lightning, but he had proven that lightning and electricity are related phenomena. And while this certainly is a fantastic story, we need to step back and realize that it is just a small piece of Franklinness. Life's work. Yes, he was already a successful printer and author at this point, but he was also an active scientist and member of the American Philosophical Society. He regularly corresponded with some of the leading natural philosophers of the day, including Thomas Young, John Mitchell, and even Isaac Newton. And he wasn't just writing letters for the sake of conversation. He was a working scientist, getting his hands dirty and making real discoveries about the world around him. In addition to his discovery about lightning, he invented the Franklin stove, which used a combination of iron and clay to heat rooms more efficiently and with less fuel. He discovered the Gulf Stream, the powerful ocean current that moderates the climate of Western Europe. And he made several other valuable discoveries about the properties of electricity, including the fact that it travels through wires better when they remade of multiple thin strands instead of a single thick wire. But this last example actually leads us to another aspect of Franklin's work that's often overlooked, his invention of bifocals. While he didn't invent glasses per se, he did invent a way to make them more useful. See? Ben Franklin had a problem. As a young man, he could read without his spectacles, but his old ones were worn out, and he couldn't afford new ones. So he went to a shop in London to see if the optician could somehow fix his existing pair so they would work better. But after looking through them, the guy just told him that he needed a new prescription. So Franklin took matters into his own hands. He carried those 2 pairs of glasses homemade. A small mark at the spot where the lenses joined the frame broke them apart, put the convex lens in the lower half and the concave lens in the upper half, and taped them back together. Voila, bifocals. And everyone benefits from this one because who doesn't love reading glasses? All of these inventions and scientific discoveries brought Franklin international fame. By the time he died in 1790, he was one of the most celebrated thinkers of his era. Scientists would line up for the chance to meet him and show him their latest findings. At the Paris Academy of Sciences, there was a bronze medal struck in his honor, and all over the world, people were talking about the amazing American philosopher. But this widespread recognition came as a surprise to no one more than Franklin himself. You see, when he was a boy, school wasn't really his thing. He disliked being inside and sitting still for hours while listening to boring lectures. And when he got into printing, he assumed that he'd spend the rest of his life working with his hands, not thinking about science. But once he started having success with his writing and printing, he found himself with a lot of free time. And he didn't want to waste it. He wanted to use it to understand the world around him. At first, he channeled this desire for knowledge into writing. In 1739, he started Poor Richard's Almanac, which was filled with interesting facts about astronomy, weather, agriculture, medicine, and just about anything else he was interested in. It was very popular, selling more than 10,000 copies in its first year alone. And this success gave him the freedom to do whatever he wanted. He didn't have to worry about making money anymore, so he could focus on learning. This is why we often see Ben Franklin described as a polymath. A polymath is someone who studies many different subjects, usually more than is typical for someone at that time period. Because Franklin had enough money to support himself by writing, he was free to study whatever caught his interest and publish his findings for others to learn from. And it turns out that this kind of learning works pretty well. If you don't believe me, just look at some of the things that he discovered. Of course, this is easier said than done. But Franklin understood that sometimes you just have to make time for the things that matter to you. Even though he was incredibly busy, he knew that if he didn't make time to learn, No one else would do it for him. So he would wake up before dawn and spend a few hours reading or conducting experiments in his kitchen. Then he'd go to work and do his best to make the world a better place. It's easy to look at Franklin now and think that he was perfect. He discovered electricity, invented bifocals, and helped found a nation. But the truth is, he was just a man trying to do his best. Sometimes he succeeded, and sometimes he failed. But no matter what, he kept trying to improve himself and make the world a better place. And that's the legacy that he left behind. Franklin understood that anyone can make a difference in the world. You don't need to be rich or famous or have a fancy degree. All you need is a willingness to learn and a passion for making things better. And that's why Franklin became one of the most celebrated thinkers of his era. He showed the world that anyone can be a scientist. All you need is a little curiosity and a lot of enthusiasm. That is the end of chapter 13. Next time we'll talk about how Franklin's scientific thinking affected his politics and the founding of a nation. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please take a second to like and subscribe. It really helps my channel grow and reach more people. Also, you can check out my new channel where I explore the amazing world of sound. There should be a link on your screen right now. As always, thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time. This is a story that might have happened and might not have happened, but whether it did or it didn't, it's certainly part of America's history. A young boy with a key and a kite unlocks the secrets of the universe. Well, maybe not unlocks, but gets zapped by lightning and lives to tell the tale. Whether it really happened or not is anyone's guess, but this story has flown into our collective memory and taken root there like a burr in a sheep's wool. So here's the story of how Ben Franklin got zapped. And by the way, before we start, welcome back to my channel. It's me and this is my channel. We're reading through the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, one chapter at a time. This is chapter 14, The Kite. And if you want to join along, you can get the book for free in the description below. Let's dive right in. So this story, the tale of young Billie Eilish and her electrifying kite, first appeared in print in 1817. Almost 30 years after Franklin died. It was written by an 18-year-old girl named Jane Maria Child. She published it in a collection of essays called the Juvenile Miscellany, or a repository of entertaining knowledge for the amusement of the young. Yikes. That's a mouthful. Anyway, it was a popular periodical aimed at children. It included stories, poems, puzzles, and articles on science and history. So, the story of poor little Billie Eilish and her shocking discovery was under the first story ever told about Ben Franklin and the kite. But it would become the most popular version, and the one that most people know today. And that's thanks, in large part, to how perfectly it captures the American spirit. Franklin himself, when he was alive, never wrote anything about this kite story. But the details he did share about his scientific experiments with electricity were enough to inspire a multitude of fictional tales. In fact, other versions predating Child's existed. For instance, in 1807, there was a broadside printed, meaning just a single sheet of paper, that tells the tale of Ben Franklin and his kite. It was called the Philadelphia Gazette and was written by one Solomon Luckin. The story is different from Child's version, but it also puts Franklin at the center of a dramatic event and paints him as a symbol of American ingenuity. By the time Child wrote her version in 1817, these kinds of stories were already part of American folklore, and that made them perfect material for children's books. That same year, 1817, an author named John Timrod wrote a story about the Kite for the Southern and Western, a literary magazine based in Louisville, Kentucky. 2 years later, it was included in a collection of Timrod's writings called the Scottish Galavidian Encyclopedia. Then in 1829, an Irish author named James Godfrey included the story in a book called the Scottish National Encyclopedia. The story is considered part of the Children's Electric Classics series. And over the years, it has been reprinted in hundreds of collections of classic children's stories. The moral of the story usually involves not questioning things too much, especially not natural phenomena like thunder and lightning. Instead, you should try to understand how things work. In addition to being popular in print, the story was also popular in artwork. Many paintings depicted Franklin with his kite, including one by Howard Pyle in 1906. There are also numerous schoolroom posters that show Franklin's iconic image with his kite in the days before electricity was well understood. This story helped shape how generations of American children viewed science, experimentation, and electricity itself. The story of Franklin and the kite shaped how we remember Franklin. Even though no one knows if he ever flew a kite in his life, the image of Franklin and the kite is so ingrained in our national consciousness that it even survives scrutiny. When Franklin's papers were published, historians learned that he had greatly exaggerated many of the details in his autobiography. He combined events that happened to him throughout his long life into a few dramatic episodes. For example, he described how he was arrested while in London and narrowly escaped execution by hanging. But this dramatic story actually happened in stages. Certain parts of the episode took place at different times during his career in London between 1741 and 1751. Franklin also claimed that he witnessed the Salem witch trials as a young man, but he was actually closer to 30 at the time and living in New York City, so he couldn't have seen the trials, which were held in Salem, Massachusetts, and he may have only heard about them in newspapers. But some versions of the Franklin kite story are so garbled that they don't resemble the original at all. Some versions say that Franklin was trying to determine if lightning was a form of electricity, and to do that he put a key on the end of a string and dangled it out the window of a house. That's not quite right. At the time, scientists believed that lightning and electricity were separate phenomena. Franklin wanted to see if lightning could conduct electricity, so he designed his kite experiment to test that idea. Other versions completely remove the key from the story altogether. They say that Franklin merely attached a string to his kite and let it fly in a thunderstorm. That sounds closer to the original, but it's still missing a key element. Franklin didn't use just any kite. He designed it specifically for his experiment. Here's what we know. On June 1753, Franklin wrote a letter to a friend in England named Peter Collinson, describing his plan to find out if lightning was a form of electricity. Ink letter, Franklin explains that he plans to attach a pointed wire to the end of a string and run it up the backbone of a large kite made of silk. The kite will have a key attached to the string, and that key will be connected to one end of a glass tube filled with water. Here's what he says. If 14 lines of this silk kite string, that's about 5 inches, can be suspended from the key, the whole charge of the lightning will be conducted down the string to the key, down the chain to the hand that holds the chain, and down the arm to the ground without any danger. Here's Franklin's illustration of how his kite should look. And here's an illustration by Howard Pyle showing Franklin launching his kite in a thunderstorm. We also know that Franklin reported seeing a flash of light from the key, but he didn't say that lightning struck the key. So did Franklin get zapped by lightning? We simply don't know. And in fact, we don't know what exactly he saw in the sky that day. Franklin's original notes describe a bright flash and a clap of thunder. He wrote, "I observed a most beautiful arching light from the eastern to the western horizon, together with a sudden clap of thunder more loud than any I had ever heard." But Franklin was reporting this to his friend, Peter Collinson, and he was so excited about his experiment that he may have described what he saw through the lens of his expectations. He wanted to prove that lightning was a form of electricity, so maybe he saw what he expected to see. The truth is, we don't know what happened that day in 1752, but whether or not lightning hit Franklin-esque, the story lived on and inspired generations of readers. It showed them that they could make discoveries, too, and that they could contribute to the world of science. And that's chapter 14. Next week, we'll continue reading through Franklin's autobiography. If you'd like to join along, you can get the book for free in the description below. Also, if you enjoyed this video and you'd like to help support the channel, consider joining my patrons. Every dollar brings us closer to our goal of $100,000, which will allow us to keep making these videos indefinitely. You'll get access to our patrons-only server where we talk about all sorts of cool stuff. The link is in the description below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week. This is Chapter 15, Conclusion. Sparks that still inspire from the Physics Puzzles series. This is a story about a girl named Amira, who is trying to fly a kite with her little brother. And it's a story about a boy named Oliver, who is at war with his school bully. And it's a story about a scientist named Isabella, who is trying to discover how lightning works. All these stories are about sparks. Sparks can make things go boom or whiz or FCZZT. What does sparks mean? Let's go back to the very first scene in this book. Back to where we met Amira and her little brother Zeke. They were outside in a big storm and they were scared. But their dad said that all storms would pass. But then lightning struck right in front of them. Now, remember what happened next? Amira took a metal pipe and she touched one end to the ground and one end to the lightning rod. In that moment, something incredible happened. The lightning flashed, not from outside, but from within. Amira, she had become part of the storm. By connecting the two ends of the circuit, she had found the source of the power inside the storm. And now let's bring Oliver into this story. He was having a tough time at school. His bully would always push him around, especially when Oliver was carrying his science project. You know those projects where you have to carry around a big, heavy box with a complicated machine inside? Well, Oliver was going to show his bully just how powerful science could be. So when his bully approached him, he pretended to trip. But really he was secretly connecting a wire between his machine and a nearby power pole. Then, just as his bully got close enough, he pulled the lever. Suddenly, electricity surged through his bully, and he started making funny faces like a zot. Was Oliver being mean? Maybe, but it was also showing just how powerful science can be. Sometimes you need to be a little bit sneaky to make electricity do what you want. But if you want to understand electricity, sometimes you need to take a different approach, like Isabella did. She wasn't a kid, but an adult scientist. She had a big idea, but it was hard to imagine how she could ever test it. Her idea was that there might be a tiny air gap in a lightning bolt. Lightning is electrical current flowing through the air. So, normally you'd think it would be a perfect connection, just like the lightning rod connected to the house in Amira's story. But Isabella thought that maybe the air molecules were actually so strongly shaken by the electric field that they created a space where no air molecules existed. A perfect vacuum, but how could she ever prove that? Well, here's the thing. There's a lot of stuff in lightning bolts, not just electricity. There's light, too, and sound. And if there's sound, then there must be vibrations. And if there are vibrations, then maybe there's a way to capture the frequencies produced by a lightning bolt. So Isabella built a machine that could listen to lightning, kind of like a Geiger counter listens to radiation. Would it work? Well, let's find out together. She built her machine out of 2 metal spheres and a length of wire, and instead of radiation, it would listen for sound waves. First, she needed to figure out what sound waves could do. She put a small piece of paper on top of the sphere and tapped the second sphere with a hammer. The paper vibrated and fell off. Then she used a bigger piece of paper and made the same experiment. The smaller sphere vibrated, but the bigger piece of paper stayed in place. It didn't fall off. Isabella realized that if the paper wasn't hit hard enough, it wouldn't vibrate at all. And if the paper wasn't hit just right, the vibrations wouldn't transfer to the second sphere. In other words, there were special frequencies that could travel from one sphere to another. If she could figure out those frequencies, then maybe she could send sound waves through a piece of string, up the wire, and then back down again into another set of strings, creating a standing wave pattern. You know, those ropes that tightrope walkers use to keep themselves upright? They're kind of like that. Now, it would be super cool if she could figure out which frequencies could do this, because then she could use the machine to identify the frequencies coming from a lightning strike, and maybe she could even use it to tell if there was a little gap in the lightning bolt. Now, in order to make this contraption work, she needed to tighten the string. So she asked her assistant to help her do that. But then suddenly, while she was holding the other end of the wire, her assistant pulled the string too tight, and the wire snapped. Remember what happened when that happened? An electrical discharge? Yes, a spark. And when the spark jumped across the gap, it made the sphere vibrate. And she saw it happen on her wrist. She had sent a vibration through the wire without hitting it with a hammer. This discovery won Isabella a Nobel Prize, and she was finally able to answer a question about whether lightning has a vacuum inside it. And it turns out, it does. In the end, she discovered that both spheres need to be charged in order to send vibrations along the wire. And when she tested this, sure enough, the string only vibrated if both ends were charged. She had shown that thunderstorms aren't just random events. They're filled with physics. They're filled with circuits and electrical charges and sound waves. They're filled with science. So remember what Amira learned. Even when you don't know everything, you can still find the answers if you ask the right questions. Like, hey, why doesn't my kite fly? Or why did people get shocked when they touch a doorknob after walking across carpet? Or how come lightning comes from inside me when I touch a lightning rod? Remember, sometimes it takes a spark to get things started, and sparks can be beautiful, but they can also be dangerous, surprising, and enlightening. Sparks can even be magical. Look, here's a magic trick for you. Do you see these two pieces of string? Neither of them is holding anything. They're hanging from nothing. Here's a hint. What do they have in common? Think about it. These two pieces of string are holding up these two flashlights. But wait, they're not tied to the flashlights. They're tied to each other. When I release the string, look, the flashlights fall down. But when I pull the strings tight, look, the flashlights float up. Magic. Now, you may not see sparks flying in your everyday life, but they're all around you. Every time you turn on a light switch, every time you charge your phone, every time you use any tool powered by electricity, you're using sparks to make your life better. So next time you see a spark, remember the stories of Amira, Oliver and Isabella, and remember that there's science all around you. You just have to know where to look. When you hear thunder rumbling in the distance, think of Amira. When you see someone standing up to a bully, think of Oliver. When you wonder how a simple spark can change the world, think of Isabella. When you see lightning flashing in the sky, think of all three of them and all the sparks that fly. Amira's kite was tangled, but that didn't stop her from trying to make it fly. In fact, it made her try harder. Amira never gave up, and in the end, she learned that even when you don't know everything, you can still find the answers if you ask the right questions. There are many more stories just like this one. Stories about girls and boys who learned about the world by asking questions and doing experiments. And you can read all about them in the rest of the books in the Physics Puzzles series. There are links to them below. I hope you enjoyed listening to this story as much as I enjoyed reading it. Thanks for watching. Thanks for watching.